The golden sun stretched over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of Silver Creek's lone road. The Silver Creek Cafe, nestled at the edge of town, stood as a familiar beacon for travelers and locals alike. Its weathered facade bore the scars of decades, much like its most loyal customer, Samuel Ironhand Mercer. Samuel eased into his corner booth as he had every morning for the past 40 years. His routine was simple. Coffee black as night, boots propped lightly on the scuffed linoleum, and the quiet hum of the world waking up beyond the cafe's wide windows. Today felt no different, or so it seemed. Maria, the cafe's owner, bustled behind the counter, her hands steady but her eyes darting nervously toward the road. "Another refill, Mr. Mercer?" she called, though his cup was still half full. Samuel raised a weathered hand, his silver rings catching the morning light. "I'm good, Maria, but you look like you've seen a ghost." "It's not ghosts," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "It's them." Samuel didn't have to ask who. The reckless jackals had been carving their path through the Rockies, terrorizing small towns like Silver Creek. Last week, it had been the diner up in Copper Ridge. Broken windows, smashed furniture, fear left in their wake. Today, their low growls, the unmistakable rumble of Harley engines, grew louder, closer. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside, but Sheriff Walker hesitated before entering. His usual confident stride seemed heavier. When he finally stepped inside, he greeted Samuel with a grim nod. "Morning, Sam." "Morning, Sheriff," Samuel replied, his gaze not leaving the highway. Walker took off his hat and sat by the door, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered sidearm. "They're here." The cafe's chatter died as the first motorcycle pulled into the lot, its chrome glinting in the sunlight. 5 more followed, their riders clad in black leather emblazoned with the snarling wolf emblem of the reckless jackals. The lead rider, Grayson "Fang" Connors, dismounted first, his boots crunching against gravel. Maria froze, her hands gripping the counter. "Maybe they'll just pass through," she whispered. Samuel finished his coffee in one slow sip, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "No, Maria," he said, standing for the first time that morning. "They've already stopped." The cafe's door swung open with a jangle, and the past Samuel had left behind walked in. The cafe door slammed shut behind Grayson "Fang" Connors, sealing the tension in the room like a storm about to break. His boots thudded heavily against the linoleum as he surveyed the quiet faces of the patrons. Behind him, 5 more jackals sauntered in, spreading out with the casual menace of men accustomed to dominance. "Well," Grayson drawled, his voice oozing false warmth, "look at this cozy little place. Didn't think towns like this still existed. A real piece of history." His gaze settled on Samuel, lingering on the old rancher's well-worn holster. "And speaking of history," Samuel remained seated, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as if oblivious to the threat in front of him. But Maria noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way his right hand rested closer to his hip. Grayson tilted his head, smirking. "Nice piece you got there, old man. Antique, isn't it? Bet you haven't drawn that thing in decades." Samuel finally looked up, his icy blue eyes meeting Grayson's. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Longer than you've been alive," he replied evenly. "But it's still faster than anything you're carrying." The cafe erupted in low chuckles from the jackals. Grayson's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That so?" he sneered. "Let's find out." He reached for the pistol tucked at his side, quick as a rattlesnake. But not quick enough. Samuel's Colt Peacemaker was out of its holster and leveled before Grayson's hand even touched his weapon. The speed was shocking, almost supernatural, a flash of silver and steel that silenced the room. Grayson froze, his fingers hovering inches from his holster. "I wouldn't," Samuel said, his voice as calm as the mountains outside. "Not unless you want to find out just how sharp an antique can be." The jackals shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering. Sheriff Walker stood slowly, his hand on his own weapon, but he didn't draw. He didn't need to. The tension in the room wasn't Grayson's to control anymore. Grayson clenched his jaw, his fingers retreating from his holster. "You think you're something, don't you, old man?" Samuel lowered his pistol, but his gaze remained locked on Grayson. "I don't think," he replied, holstering the Colt with a practiced motion. "I know." From outside, the rumble of engines grew louder. Reinforcements were coming, but for which side? The rumble of approaching engines grew louder, shaking the walls of Silver Creek Cafe as if the town itself held its breath. Grayson Connors' sneer faltered, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. He turned toward the window, expecting more jackals. But the sight that greeted him froze the gang leader in place. Pickup trucks, ranch vehicles, and even an old sheriff's van rolled into the parking lot, their occupants stepping out in quiet determination. Men and women armed with more than just weapons, armed with resolve, filled the lot. This wasn't a gang coming to intimidate, it was Silver Creek rising to defend itself. Sheriff Walker stepped forward, his boots echoing in the tense silence. "Grayson Connors," he said, his voice firm but calm, "you and your boys have overstayed your welcome. Lay down your weapons now, and we'll handle this the peaceful way." Grayson scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Peaceful way? Sheriff, do you really think these farmers and ranchers can handle the reckless jackals?" Samuel stood then, his presence commanding as he stepped past the sheriff and toward the jackals. The quiet strength in his movements carried more weight than any threat could. "You're wrong about one thing, son," Samuel said, his voice carrying over the tension. "This isn't about handling you. It's about ending this." Grayson's hand hovered near his holster, his pride unwilling to let him back down. "You think one town full of hicks can stop us? You can't fight us forever." Samuel stopped just a few feet away, his piercing gaze fixed on the younger man. "Maybe not forever," he said evenly. "But today, I'm more than enough." Behind Samuel, Maria stepped cautiously to the cafe counter. With trembling hands, she lifted the receiver of the landline phone. Samuel glanced her way and gave her a subtle nod. She dialed quickly, her voice quiet but firm. "It's time." Outside, more trucks pulled in, bringing reinforcements from nearby towns, familiar faces ready to stand together. Samuel turned back to Grayson, his calm now edged with steel. "You've got two choices: walk away and face the law, or make the mistake of thinking you can win." The jackals hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Grayson's jaw tightened, but the rumble of approaching engines was no longer on his side. The tide was turning, and he could feel it. "Your move, son," Samuel said, his hand resting lightly near his Colt. "But choose wisely. This town's done being afraid." The growing crowd outside Silver Creek Cafe became a symbol of defiance, each new arrival eroding the reckless jackal's confidence. Farmers with dirt-streaked hands, ranchers gripping old rifles, and even shopkeepers wielding tools of their trade stood shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't just Silver Creek anymore. This was the strength of the surrounding community, united by years of shared hardship and a refusal to bow to fear. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Grayson Connors shifted uneasily as he watched his supposed dominance crumble with every new truck pulling into the lot. His men, once so cocky, now exchanged uneasy glances, their swagger evaporating in the face of overwhelming resolve. The jackals were outnumbered, outflanked, and for the first time, outmatched. Samuel Mercer stepped closer to Grayson, his boots tapping lightly on the worn linoleum. He wasn't smiling, but there was no malice in his weathered face, only a quiet certainty. "I've seen men like you before," Samuel said, his voice low but sharp as a blade, "thinking you can take what you want because no one will stop you. But every wolf learns. There's always something stronger." Grayson's pride wouldn't let him back down entirely. "We've got chapters in 3 states, he spat, his bravado returning in short bursts. "What's a handful of dirt farmers going to do against us? You think you can hold this town forever?" Samuel tilted his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Grayson's. Forever isn't the point. Today is. He gestured toward the parking lot, where even more vehicles were pulling in. Among them was a convoy of deputies from nearby towns, their lights flashing but their approach calm. Your reign ends here. Sheriff Walker stepped forward, his voice steady. Grayson Connors, you and your gang are under arrest for vandalism, theft, and terrorizing these highways. Throw down your weapons, and this ends peacefully. For a moment, it seemed Grayson might lash out. His hand twitched toward his gun, but Samuel's hand was faster, his Colt Peacemaker halfway drawn before Grayson even moved. The old rancher's voice cut through the silence like thunder. Don't. Grayson froze. Behind him, one of the younger jackals hesitated before tossing his weapon to the floor. Another followed, then another, until the clatter of surrender echoed through the cafe. Finally, with a growl of frustration, Grayson ripped off his leather cut and threw it onto the counter. This isn't over, he muttered. Samuel holstered his Colt, his movements slow and deliberate. You're right about one thing, he replied, his voice carrying both finality and hope. It's not over, but it's not going to end the way you think. As the deputies moved in to cuff the gang, Samuel turned to Sheriff Walker. Round them up, then let's talk about rebuilding what they broke. The reckless jackal's terror had ended, but Samuel knew the real work was just beginning. The reckless jackals sat in the back of a convoy of sheriff's trucks, their heads hung low as they were escorted to Silver Creek's small holding station. The parking lot of the cafe, once filled with roaring engines and threats, now buzzed with murmurs of relief and determination. But amidst the triumph, Samuel Mercer remained quiet, his gaze lingering on the trail of dust left by the departing vehicles. Inside the cafe, Maria set about cleaning the counter, her hands steadier now. Sheriff Walker stood by the door, radioing updates to neighboring towns, while the townsfolk began filing inside, their chatter a mix of exhaustion and hope. You think they'll stay down? Walker asked Samuel, his voice low as he watched the rancher refill his coffee. Samuel took a slow sip, his hand as steady as the mountains outside. That depends, he said. Depends on whether someone teaches them there's a better way. Walker frowned, unsure of Samuel's meaning. What are you thinking? Samuel set his cup down, his blue eyes unwavering. People like Grayson don't wake up one day and decide to wreak havoc. Somewhere along the line, he forgot what strength is supposed to mean. If no one reminds him, he'll just keep on forgetting. The sheriff's brow furrowed, his skepticism evident. You're suggesting what? Rehabilitation? For men who've terrorized half the county? Not just rehabilitation, Samuel said, his voice firm. Redemption. That afternoon, Samuel rode out to the sheriff's station where the jackals were being processed. Grayson sat apart from his men, his hands cuffed and his jaw tight. The anger in his eyes had dulled, replaced by something heavier. Regret, perhaps, though it was buried deep. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, his hat casting a shadow across his face. Grayson, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Do you know what a wolf does when it's cornered? Grayson didn't answer, his shoulders tense. It doesn't lash out, Samuel continued. It listens, it learns, and if it's smart, it finds a new path. Grayson's eyes flicked up, meeting Samuel's. What do you want from me, old man? I want you to decide who you're going to be, Samuel replied. A man who keeps running, or a man who stands for something real. Grayson didn't respond, but the crack in his armor was visible. Samuel straightened, tipping his hat. Think about it, son. We'll be watching. Outside, Samuel joined Walker and Maria, who had come to see the aftermath. What now? Maria asked. Now, Samuel said, his voice steady, we build. And we don't just rebuild fences and walls. We rebuild people. One brick at a time. The reckless jackal's terror had ended, but the road to redemption was just beginning. And Samuel knew it was a road worth traveling. The days following the jackal's surrender marked a turning point for Silver Creek. What had begun as a small-town standoff transformed into a movement of renewal. Samuel Mercer was at its heart, not as a hero or sheriff, but as a man who understood the weight of second chances. Grayson Connors and his crew sat in the town's holding station, their arrogance dulled by long hours of reflection. Samuel visited every day, never with a gun, only with his words. "You know, this town doesn't just want revenge," Samuel told Grayson one afternoon, leaning against the bars of the holding cell. "What they want is their peace back. But peace doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from people learning to do better." Grayson scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "What makes you think we can do better?" Samuel smiled faintly, a spark of warmth behind his weathered face. "Because I've seen men worse than you turn it around. The question is whether you've got the guts to try." The following week, Grayson and his gang were put to work. Under the sheriff's supervision and Samuel's quiet leadership, the Jackals began repairing the very damage they'd caused. Fence posts were reset, barns repainted, and broken windows replaced. The work was grueling, and the townsfolk kept a watchful eye, but there was a shift in the air, a sense of grudging possibility. One morning, Maria arrived at the cafe early to find Grayson painting the exterior wall. His strokes were slow and deliberate, as if every brush of color wiped away some unseen weight. "I never thought I'd see the day," Maria said, her voice tentative but sincere. Grayson paused, turning to her. His face was unguarded for the first time, no mask of bravado or anger. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but it feels good. Better than I expected." Maria gave him a cautious smile. "That's what happens when you build instead of break." Samuel didn't miss a day of work, always alongside the Jackals. He was their steady guide, teaching them skills they'd never had, mending fences, restoring old tractors, and even repairing engines in Joe Hernandez's garage. Grayson, reluctant at first, soon became the most eager to learn. "What's this all for?" Grayson asked Samuel one afternoon as they worked side by side. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow, looking out over the horizon. "It's not about what's behind you, son. It's about what's ahead. Every mile forward is a chance to leave the past in the dust." Grayson nodded slowly, a new resolve lighting his expression. "And if we can't leave it behind?" Samuel smiled, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Then you turn it into something better." As the Jackals' work spread across Silver Creek, so did hope. What began as a punishment was evolving into something stronger: redemption. For the first time in years, Grayson and his crew weren't running from their mistakes. They were building something real. A year had passed since the reckless Jackals rolled into Silver Creek, intent on tearing it apart. Now the town stood stronger than ever. Not just rebuilt, but transformed. The scars of the past remained, but they served as reminders of the strength born from unity and the power of redemption. At the center of it all was Samuel Mercer, seated in his usual booth at the Silver Creek Cafe. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson as he sipped his coffee, watching the world beyond the cafe's windows. Outside, the streets bustled with life. Townsfolk greeting one another, workers repairing fences, and laughter spilling from the community center where Grayson Connors now spent his days mentoring local youth. The Jackals were no more. In their place stood men who had chosen a different path, guided by Samuel's quiet wisdom and the town's unwavering resolve. Grayson had become the leader Samuel had hoped he could be, not of a gang, but of a movement. That morning, the town gathered in the cafe's parking lot to unveil a plaque, its bronze surface gleaming in the sunlight. Maria stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This plaque isn't just for what we've rebuilt," she began, "but for the people who made it possible, for those who chose to stand together instead of letting fear divide us." She turned to Samuel, her eyes shining. "And for a man who reminded us all that redemption is possible, no matter how far we've fallen." The crowd applauded as Samuel nodded humbly, tipping his hat. Grayson stepped forward then, his face no longer hardened by anger or pride, but softened by gratitude. "I used to think strength meant power," Grayson said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But I've learned that real strength is building something that lasts, something that matters. And none of us would have learned that without this town, or without Samuel Mercer." The applause swelled, and Samuel, ever modest, simply said, "It's not about me, it's about all of you. Strength isn't in one man's hands, it's in a community that refuses to give up." Later that day, Samuel walked the streets of Silver Creek, nodding at the changes around him. The community center bustled with activity, ranches thrived, and young men, once on the edge of destruction, now worked to make their town stronger. Grayson stood outside the garage, helping a teenager fix his first engine, his laughter echoing down the street. As Samuel reached the edge of town, he paused, looking out at the open road stretching beyond the horizon. The highway that once carried fear now symbolized hope, a road not to escape from the past, but to forge a better future. Maria's voice called from the cafe. "Coffee's still warm, Samuel." He turned back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Keep it ready. I'll be right there." Samuel tipped his hat to the road one last time before heading home, not just to the cafe, but to the town he had helped save, a town where strength, redemption, and unity had become its enduring legacy. Silver Creek's journey wasn't over, and neither was his. The road ahead was long, but Samuel knew one thing for sure: it was a road worth traveling. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.